frame by frame animated run cycle with our monkey character. To begin with, we have a sketch which we put together from the animatic, and using this and our character turnaround, we're gonna start putting together the motion of the character. The turnaround is gonna be used mostly when we get to the solid line work. So for now, let's get started with our poses and our keyframes. One thing that you should know about this tutorial is it's sort of a streamlined version of the many broken apart segments of tutorials on keyframe animation in this pack. So we're going to begin with keyframes and pose-to-pose animation, then go on to our breakdown frames, then work in our solid drawings, put in our in-betweens, color in our image, and tweak our motion. But rather than segmenting it all into those separate parts which we have in the rest of the resources, we're going to do it all in the one video. But it's a shorter cycle, so it should be a lot more bearable. So to begin with, I'm going to convert it into a symbol and call it monkey run. This is just the way Flash works. If you're using other animation programs, don't worry about it. We're basically going to be doing the same thing throughout. So to start off with, we're going to create our keyframe poses. So we have our starting pose, like I said, which we put together in the animatic. And what I want to do is on a new layer, I want to sketch the same shape as the circle of the head, because the head's proportions are not going to change throughout our keyframe animation. So once I've sketched out my circle here, I'll put it off into the side and it's on a layer of its own, and I can now sort of grab this, copy and paste it whenever I need to reuse that shape. So I'll just make it the grey colour. I made it red just so it stood out from what I was drawing before. And then going back to my original layer and renaming it monkey, I'm going to set up my initial poses. Now, something about this process is that with run cycles, we tend to feel a little repetitious because we have two sort of parts of the run cycle. The first part is where the right leg touches and bears the weight against the ground, and the second part is where the left leg touches and bears the weight against the ground. And the reason I say it's repetitious is because our middle and starting positions for both of those two parts of a single run or walk cycle often look the same, except the limbs are swapped. So I'm going to drag out my timeline, and because it's a run cycle, it's actually going to be pretty rapid. And the first thing I want to do is get my timing to a place where I'm happy with it. So at the moment I have 16 frames. So halfway along these 16 frames, I'm going to duplicate this keyframe that I've already sketched out here, and then halfway between the halfway point, I'm going to create a new keyframe. I'm turning on my onion skin so I can see the frame previous, and I'm pasting the head that I previously drew. And this is now when I can draw in my next pose. I'm going to have the body sort of scrunch up into a sort of wedged position because I want the character to have a lot of bounce in this run cycle. I'm going to lock my circle frame so I don't make any edits there because that's going to get annoying otherwise. And I'm going to get my body nice and low to the ground and move my limbs so that the legs are really, really bent. That's probably a little too far forward. I'm going to move that leg more towards the middle like this. And again, very sketchy, I'm going to draw in the legs in a position for the run. When the body's low, I'm going to have the hands sort of lowering slightly as they will be sort of weighty at the end compared to the shoulder. So they're going to be dragged down with the weight of the body. And then the tail is also going to bounce down a little bit with the weight of the body. Now with that being drawn, in terms of the run cycle being repetitious, essentially I can exemplify this by copying and pasting that entire frame I've drawn and just swap this back leg to now become the front leg. And then that essentially is the run cycle. But of course that's going to be really boring, so we're going to make efforts throughout our run cycle to add a little interest and make sure it's not completely symmetrical in the first and second half of the run cycle. I'm going to turn on the repeat area selection in Flash just so I can have it play through and make sure I have a bit of a pace that I'm happy with. So that seems pretty alright to me. I'm going to make a few tweaks between the two areas now. The first half I'm going to keep the way it is, and then the second half I'm going to make a few tweaks. The first thing I'm going to tweak is the tail, because it's something that is very easy to be quite fluid with and be a little more sporadic and unpredictable with. So I'm just going to stretch the tail out in a bit more of a random direction and maybe have it bounce up in this direction. So let's see what that looks like. It looks a little odd at the very end there, so I'm going to still have it curve the other way, but maybe just a little more rounded. So I'm fairly happy with that. You can see what I mean now in the fact that it's not too repetitious. Here in the next up frame, I'm going to drag the hands so that they're angled down more. Maybe drag the head back more so it's leaning back. I might actually even in the first frame drag the head forward a bit just to show particularly that there is a contrast, and I'm going to draw in the eye line as well, just to show that the head is changing its angle. Now when I play, you can see that there's a lot more drama there. I feel like the angle of this head leaning back is a bit too much. I'm going to soften it a bit, drag it in, and lower that angle slightly. Play it again. Okay, so that's something I'm much happier with. So already we have our keyframes of animation in. Now we're going to work on the breakdowns. And the breakdown frames are going to be in between each of these keyframe animations, and they're going to dictate the interest of the motion, because at the moment it's pretty straightforward. So now I'm going to create a blank keyframe in between our first two keyframes. And with my onion skin on, I'm going to paste the head. Now, to make the motion really dynamic, I don't want the head to be directly between the top and bottom heads that I'm moving our breakdown keyframe into. So what I want to do is actually follow the motion with the propulsion that the character is using. He's really leaping forward. So in the breakdown, and with the onion skin on, I'm going to have the head leap forward, and then in the second breakdown, I'm going to have the head drag back. I'm going to copy and paste these head frames on all of the breakdown layers. We can see that we're getting much more of a leaping forward motion. So now in the breakdowns, it's up to me to create an interesting body dynamic and create subtle changes throughout with the limbs. So the first thing I want to do is have the body really stretch forward like this, with the pelvis forward, and have the front foot, which I believe is the foot that's reaching out, have the front foot straight and with the foot angled up like this. I'm also going to have the back leg curl out towards the back here, so we have that kick sort of add some extremity. And I'm going to have the elbows pull back slightly and the hands drag back near the face and in front of the face. So now I'm going to draw in the tail between these two frames, and I want to complement the curves that I've already established just to show a nice smooth animation with the tail as he's running along. Remember too that as the body's jumped forward quite a bit, the tail is going to be shorter on our breakdown than it is on the keyframes, because it's also further forward than it is on the previous frames. So now that I've got that in, I'll draw in my eye line. His head's going to be curved up before it curves down to show that it's dragging behind a bit. And here on this next keyframe, I actually want to push this down a bit. I really want to get some squash happening. I'm going to do the same with the repetition of this keyframe. Really want to make sure that we get some dynamic movement happening, because when we use keyframe animation, we really want to make the most out of the fact that we have such flexibility. And if we're going to spend the time to do it, we might as well do it interestingly. So in my next breakdown, I need to have the body somewhere between these two. So I'm going to have a really stretched out butt as the back begins to arch, and I'm going to have the back foot really stretch out and push hard off the ground as the rear leg lunges forward. And to accentuate this, I'm going to have a bend in the knee and show an animation smear of the leg leaping forward like that. So that's going to hopefully accentuate the movement in an interesting way. And now I'm going to have the hands, which have just come up in front of the face, I'm going to have them follow through down to slightly below the face, like so. And I'm going to have the tail continue to follow that motion that we've sort of established in the two frames. So I'm sort of drawing an in-between with the tail so far, and we'll see if that's interesting when we go through and play once we've got all the breakdowns in place. After I draw the eye line, I'm going to just hide my onion skin and flick through these frames to see how I feel about them. I think I'm pretty happy with them so far. So we've got some dramatic movement. Now we have another breakdown to draw, so I'll bring my onion skin back and keep my eye line quite high. And this time I'm going to do something different. With my first breakdown, I have an arched back like so. In this breakdown, for him leaping forward the second time, I'm going to have his back curved, just to add something different, just to make sure that we're switching it up a bit. So I'm going to have my leg begin to bend in at the front and come forward. Meanwhile, the rear leg is colliding with the ground, and we're going to accentuate that motion. You'll notice we have an arc of motion in the body here quite clearly, which is good because it's in the direction of the contact point at the foot where he's landing. Now I'm going to have the arms come in and bend again like it did in the first breakdown between these poses, but this time the elbow is going to be a bit lower, and I'll have the backhand come forward a bit. I'm just trying to switch it up just so that both of the animation portions, the start half and the end half, have some differences and have some interesting highlights so that when we play through it feels organic. Finally, for my last breakdown, I'm going to copy and paste my first keyframe to the very end, past the end of the animation, just so I have both in my onion skin frame to use as a reference. Now, similar to the other version of this leg coming forward, I'm going to have a slightly bent knee with an animation smear complementing that rapid motion. Meanwhile, the back leg is going to aggressively be pushing off on the ground. I feel like this smear could be more extreme, so I'm just going to stretch it out a bit more. And these arms, I'm going to just kind of go halfway between the poses, and the tail I'll do the same. Next, I'm going to draw the eye line, and I feel like that should be it. So I'm going to play once again with my loop on and see how that feels. So I've now created my keyframes and now my breakdown poses, and as you can see, it's an asymmetrical run, so it doesn't feel like we're looping between 8 frames, we're actually looping now between 16 different frames, and I'm about to now go into my solid line work. But in doing so, I want to point out something that's important to keep in mind, and that is that redrawing the head in every keyframe pose without a really solid reference or something to follow directly is a bit of a daring thing to do. Reason being is it's very easy for you to slightly change the size of the eye or the nose or the ear from frame to frame until by the end it's at a different size than it is at the start, or even if it returns to the same size, it feels like it shrinks and grows throughout the animation. So to avoid doing this, first of all, I'm going to get rid of my circle frame because I don't need that anymore, but I'm going to open a new layer and I'm going to call this reference. And in this layer, I'm going to bring in my trusty old character turnaround. Now, I'm hoping by now you can tell that the character turnaround has some extremely helpful uses, and this is one of them. So once I get it to the size that I want it to be, I'm going to break it apart like so and hide my monkey sketches and just delete everything except for this side view of the monkey's head. And now I have a reference which I can draw the monkey's head on. I'm going to be a little more meticulous and delete these little rough edges around the reference that I have here just by using my lasso tool, like so. And now I have a monkey head I'm going to turn into a symbol, and I'm going to call it reference head. And now bringing back my sketch layer, I'm going to drag my reference to the top, but I'm going to change the color effect to alpha and lower the alpha quite significantly so that we have just a very faint line for the monkey's position. And now I'm going to change the pivot point and position the head on the sort of eye angle that we've set up in our sketch here with the eye and ear along that eye line. And then I'm going to create a new keyframe with the head rotated and positioned following that eye line every time. In doing this throughout the whole animation, I'm not going to actually reuse the same illustration of the head throughout, but I've set up a reference point that's going to be so useful, which you'll see by the time I get to animating the head, because I can trace around the shape of the basic parts of the head and then redraw the features as I want to. For example, changing the expression throughout the run, or tweaking the hair to move through the motion of the animation without actually changing proportions. So if I close the eyelids or if I move the mouth, at the end of the day I have this core reference to come back to, and that's going to be so useful. So I'm pasting this throughout, and then I'm just going to have to play through once more just to see that the angle of the head feels good. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now, of course, the monkey isn't going to have a happy expression, because in the context of the animation that we're putting this clip in, he's going to be quite terrified. But we can still use this as a foundation to follow, and now we're ready to add some solid drawing. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this Solid Drawing. And now I'm going to draw my monkey entirely following the sketches I've established. It's a pretty simple sort of character, so I don't need any more references other than the head there, because the limbs are pretty straightforward, and I've drawn him so much now in the other animation sections that I don't really feel like I need a huge amount of reference other than what I've sketched. So now I'm up to drawing the head, and it's going to be a lot simpler now that I have my reference in there. Could you imagine trying to accurately draw without a solid foundation to follow and maintain proportions throughout? It would be quite difficult. So things like the silhouette of the face won't really change, but now I can do things like open up the mouth into a different expression, which will be suited more specifically to the run cycle I'm creating here. So for example, I can raise the lower eyelid, and I'm going to have the eye look straight forward, and the pupils are sort of dilated, so I'm just drawing them smaller and with a bigger highlight in the middle. The other thing I'm going to do here, of course, is change the direction of the tuft of hair at the front of his face, because it only makes sense that there's a lot of motion and wind sort of pushing that back as he's running forward. And then we have the back of the head, and then we've done our first monkey pose. And we're basically going to follow that routine moving forward to make our monkey's run cycle. I'm repositioning the tail in this frame because in my sketch it's a little bit too high at the base near the butt, so I'm just moving that down just to make sure it's in line with the rest of the body. Otherwise this keyframe is done and I'm moving on to the next one. One thing you can do is change the expression throughout the run cycle just to add some interest. So for example, I might have the mouth close slightly and show the bottom teeth, like so. So it's like his mouth falling shut as he's going down. And then the other thing that we need to keep in mind is the physicality of things like the hair. So it's going to be sort of thrown down a bit here as he lands quite hard against the ground. One thing that I realise I've accidentally done is start off with the front leg when that should apparently be the rear leg, but it doesn't matter. I'm just going to continue on replacing the rear leg with the front leg, and it'll still work. I just need to sort of adjust the brushwork to fit in that leg as I go. So it's not a big deal because, like I said, that sort of first half and second half of the run cycle, especially with the limbs, are pretty interchangeable. So I'm ready to do another keyframe, but I just want to turn off my guides and flick back through the animation and see how it feels so far. I'm pretty happy with that motion. I can zoom out just to make sure that I'm seeing everything pretty clearly. I think that looks pretty cool. I'm happy with the hair motion, so he hits the ground, the hair flops down until he's up again, and then in the next keyframe that we're doing now, the hair's going to start to pull back again like it did in the first keyframe. And I don't need my onion skin on, I don't know why I put that on. So I have the hair starting to pull back again because we have the full momentum impacting his run once more as he's running down, and the expression has changed as well, so he has a bit more of a wide-eyed and wide-mouthed look that sort of closes up a bit. And what I want to do is keep the eyes more closed as I open up the mouth once again, because we do need to return to our original facial pose, but we don't have to do it uniformly. So I'm going to return the mouth, opening it up a little bit more first, and I'll raise the eyelid a little bit more as well. Otherwise the rest of the face is pretty straightforward and we get to follow our guide. And I hope you can see how useful it is having a reference like this in place. To do a run cycle when you're drawing a head anew with every single frame of animation would be quite a lot of work, and for the most part I imagine that people would mostly reuse the head in a tween and do the animation of the body separately, and that's something I've done from time to time as well. But in an example like this, we want to create a pure frame by frame full body and face animation from start to finish and take full advantage of that by changing the expression. But by having the solid structure there to copy and then alter as we need to, we're optimizing our time as much as possible, which is really useful. Once again, flicking back and forward between these frames to see if I'm happy with them. The front hand is sort of moving into the front and now it's towards the back, so I should maintain that somewhat. So even though the sketches that I've done don't really follow that, I'm going to follow that here. So I'll draw the front hand and then I'm going to draw the back hand a little further out, just so that there's a little bit of that motion respected. And then I'm going to come back to the face and open up the eye this time as we return to an expression more akin to our original first frame of animation. Open up the eyes a bit and raise the eyelids fully, and this time let's go the extreme. Let's really open up the mouth a bit in as wide a face of terror as we can get away with. Once again, the hair is beginning to sort of flop in front of the face because he's hit the ground quite hard. I haven't been worrying about that little tuft at the back of the hair, seeing as though it's so small and mostly unnoticed that it would probably only serve to distract if I did too much animation with it specifically. So now the body is all curled up, the tail continues to float out, and our back leg is starting to come forward. So I need to not get too distracted by the fact that I've done the wrong legs here. Hope you can forgive that. I'll draw my front leg solid to the ground, my belly and tummy curved around, and the monkey, and now the back leg is scrunched up and coming forward like so. I believe that's the end of this keyframe once the hand's drawn in, and I'm just going to check by hiding my references and flicking back and forward between them just to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. I have gotten a bit too much of a blocky outline on the tummy here, which is important to keep nice and squishy looking. And now we're back to our final new line work frame. So we are going to do the same thing, but this is one of the last times that we're doing it without any guidance. So now that I've finished my line work, there is one thing I want to go back and finish in regards to the hair. I'll show you what that is. In the first run through, as he lowers to the ground, he hits the ground and his hair flops down. By the time he reaches his full up position, his hair is halfway between being pulled back in this direction and being pushed down in that direction. So it's basically in a neutral position. In the first frame of the animation, it should be in that same position because that is basically at the apex of that step as well, because we hit down and then it's being dragged down as he goes up, and then we should have our neutral position here, which I'll follow my guide for, and then the hair gets pulled back. So that's just made the flow of the hair a little bit more consistent throughout. But now if I zoom out and add my repeating thingy, what do you call it, selection, I'm going to play through, and as you can see, his expression changes throughout, and we're making the most of the fact that we're doing a frame-by-frame animation. It really does look like he's acting dynamically rather than repeating through half of the length of what we've got here, which is really cool. So the next thing we're going to do is our in-betweens. So I'm going to copy all of my solid drawings and paste them on a layer above and hide my previous solid drawings layer. That way it's there as a reference for when you go through this, you can kind of check out the layers as it's developed. So I'll turn this into a guide, and it's there to look at when you want to. And I'm also going to turn my references into guides and hide them as well, because now we only need our clean line work. We're creating blank keyframes between all of our current keyframes there, adding a keyframe at the very end to create a blank keyframe between, which is our first frame, so that our last current keyframe has an in-between between it and the very first keyframe, so that we get a smooth loop. And now one by one, I'm going to select these blank keyframes, turn on my onion skin tool, and I'm going to draw in between each of these frames. So it's pretty straightforward. This is a situation where I'm going to need my monkey head reference. So I'm going to bring that back and drag that into the middle so I can follow that, and I'm going to turn my onion skin into a wireframe when I draw the head so that I have a pretty solid reference between them to follow. That way I can still follow that solid framework of the head between these frames. For now I'm just going to create duplicate keyframes of this reference head and just position it in the places that I need it, angling it for each time. And now it's up to me to draw the lines in between, and it's not as complicated as the in-between frames in the full animation segment that there were several tutorial sections on. This is much more drawing the lines between the lines. So for example, with this leg here, it's a little more complicated to follow because there's a tail sort of in the way as well, but we just need to identify which two frames are the legs and draw the lines directly between those poses. This leg is an easy example. We have one leg in that position and another leg in a higher position. So I'm going to draw a leg now directly between the two with a pose that is halfway between both poses. Now with the head, I'm following the outline of my reference and I'm drawing the pose to be exactly between the previous head frames. Now obviously it can be quite confusing at this point because there's a lot of business in the line works. We need to just identify which ones are the ones belonging to the reference head that we set up and start to use those as our guide, and then draw the poses and positions to be sort of similar to the frame before and the frame following. Every now and then it's good to remove the onion skin and just jump back and forward between the frames and make sure we haven't forgotten anything, like this back hand here, which I have forgotten. And then we can once again do the same thing, flick back and forward, and just make sure everything's there, make sure all the lines are filled in and don't have any gaps for when we come back to it later to colour in. And now we're ready to continue on with the next in-between frame. It's still quite difficult to interpret these center frames sometimes, but the reality is having my reference with the monkey's head that I can follow the outline to saves a lot of the guesswork, and that is, when it comes to in-betweens, one of the most frustrating things at times, having to try and decipher where to draw these lines. But the fact that here I can follow that outline really saves a lot of frustration and strain, and the only things that I'm sort of doing my calculations on are the eyes and the features of the face. Otherwise, the silhouette is pretty easy to follow. Now I'm going to turn off my onion skin and flick between these frames, draw in the last of the details between the transitions and just make sure that everything's there. So now I'm going to hide my reference layer. I'm going to delete that end frame, the duplicate of the first frame, and zoom out, and I'm going to loop and see what this looks like. And there we have our monkey on a run cycle, and I'm trying to look at it and pick flaws that I can notice and fix up. But the reality is, because it's going at 24 frames per second on singles, I can't seem to see anything in particular that I want to fault. So I'm quite happy with that. As I've done previously, I'm going to copy all of this and add it to a new layer and guide and lock and hide my previous layer. I'm going to rename that layer In-Betweens, and this new layer is going to be Color. So now, you guessed it, I'm going to add color. I can find the color from my reference here. So with my eyedropper tool, I'll paint in the light skin, the dark skin, and the monkey hair colors. And starting off with the brown, I'm just going to paint in all these color areas. Once again, every time you find a crack, try and fill in wherever you think that crack might be, and then try and paint it again, and hopefully it'll have fixed the problem. But for the most part, this should be fairly straightforward, especially because everything is on one layer, including the tail. Oh, and of course I keep forgetting the eyebrows, so let's not make a habit of that. So as you can see, it can be satisfying to create a frame-by-frame run cycle because we recycle these frames that we've drawn, and even though it took a bit of time and a bit of work to make something that we're satisfied with in the end, the result is something that is quite satisfying to put into a context. I quite enjoy seeing the hair bounce along with the motion and the tail, because they have their follow-through animations, and that can add a lot of interest to your animation. Okay, so as you can see here, it's not filling it all, so I'm going to segment it into sections and paint. Okay, so obviously the problem is in this top half, so I'm just going to section off areas, and wherever it's not filling in, the error is. So I'm going to start filling in cracks in this area, and there we go, we've figured out the problem. That's just sort of a workaround that you can do in Flash to make it work. I've done the colouring in process in Toon Boom before. It's quite similar. I had to figure out a way to make it work with what I'm used to doing in terms of here when I draw the outline for the shadow area. In Toon Boom I had to sort of cut the painted area first and then go back and add the next color. The advantage of a program like Toon Boom, for anyone who uses Toon Boom or is interested in it, is you can change palettes on the fly without having to repaint all of the work you've done, which is a very cool advantage. But Flash, I feel, has a much lower bar for entry, and I think that is pretty pivotal for developing artists and animators. And I think personally I would always recommend starting off with Flash over Toon Boom, but I do believe Toon Boom has much higher room for growth. Now you'll notice what I'm doing is painting the back hand and foot always in the darker skin color, and this is just going to help separate them from the front-handed foot, because the run cycle is so fast it's going to be hard for viewers to sort of identify what's happening or to separate those limbs. So we can do it for them by guiding the eye towards the back one or the front one and sort of separating them visually like this. So now I've finished doing that first layer of shadow, and now comes the fun bit, the very last bit where we're filling in the highlights of the skin, and this is basically the finishing touch of this animation. So I do need to rock back and forward and just make sure I haven't missed anything, because sometimes I might miss the bottom of the eyelid, but going across, it's really fun to see it all unfold and solidify. Now this is the last extensive animation section in the course, if you watch it chronological, of course. Otherwise, if you've sort of watched this bit first, then ignore my rambling. But I guess I just wanted to thank you for supporting my work. I've put quite a lot of time and effort into making sure that this course is as in-depth as possible while being fairly straightforward and digestible for beginners, because the 12 principles of animation can be a little bit difficult to tackle head first, especially in some of the books by the masters, and in books like The Illusion of Life and The Animator Survival Kit, which all of which I recommend highly, of course. They can be pretty intensive, and I'm hoping that through the course of this animation series and these tutorials that I've presented them in a way that is practical and something that you can apply in your own animations. So here we have our finished monkey, and I'm going to put on that loop and I'm going to zoom out, and that is a run cycle I'm very happy with. A frame by frame run cycle. I don't really need to do any motion tweaks because I'm quite happy with the outcome here. So there we go. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how you create a frame by frame animated run cycle. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for supporting my work.